The hallways of Horizon Haven Medical Center were eerily silent during the late-night shift, the kind of quiet that settled over the hospital after visiting hours ended and the bustling daytime energy faded into the low hum of medical equipment. Nurse Emily Hart moved through her rounds with the practiced ease of someone who'd worked dozens of nights in this very setting. Despite the stillness, there was always something unsettling about the midnight hour in a hospital, an unspoken tension lingering in the air, as though the walls themselves were keeping secrets. Emily was finishing up in room 203, a routine check on a post-op patient, when she glanced down the corridor and noticed Dr. Charles Ambrose, a distinguished but reserved cardiologist, hurrying down the hallway. Dr. Ambrose was well regarded, but his reputation was layered with tales of perfectionism and an almost surgical coldness in his interactions with patients and staff alike. Recently, however, his demeanor had changed, becoming more secretive and curt. On that particular night, something in his movements caught her attention. He was making his way toward the ICU ward, but it wasn't his typical purposeful stride. Instead, he seemed to be slipping through the shadows, glancing back occasionally, as if ensuring no one was watching. Emily had a lingering curiosity about Dr. Ambrose's late-night habits. Rumors among the nursing staff suggested he was tending to a special patient, but no one had dared to pry further. This mystery was the subject of many whispers, yet no one could uncover the full story. As she wrapped up her tasks and made her way back to the nurse's station, she saw her colleague, Mia. Emily decided to share what she'd observed, half expecting Mia to brush it off as overactive imagination. "Hey, Mia, have you noticed Dr. Ambrose tonight?" Emily asked quietly, casting a quick look over her shoulder. Mia leaned in, smirking. "You mean Dr. Enigma?" "Oh yeah. He's been doing his mysterious rounds again," she said with a touch of sarcasm. "I swear, he's like a ghost in here sometimes. Shows up, vanishes, and leaves everyone wondering what he's up to." Emily chuckled but couldn't shake the feeling that something unusual was brewing. "He's been visiting that patient in ICU room 407, right? The one in a coma." Mia shrugged, fiddling with her pen. "Yeah, I think so. Nobody really knows the details. All I know is that Mrs. Callahan, our regular coma patient, has been here for months, and Dr. Ambrose has been hovering around ever since she was admitted. The doctors say it's a typical case of prolonged comatose state, but..." Mia's voice trailed off as she raised an eyebrow. "But you'd think they would have moved her to long-term care by now." Emily nodded. Mrs. Callahan's case had puzzled her as well. The woman had arrived in critical condition nearly 3 months ago after a severe heart attack, which had led to her slipping into a coma. Most comatose patients didn't stay this long in the ICU unless there was a specific plan for recovery. And yet here she was, and Dr. Ambrose, a cardiologist with no formal expertise in neurology, seemed exceptionally invested in her. Deciding to let the matter rest for the moment, Emily moved to another patient room, her thoughts wandering to her own reasons for becoming a nurse. Her grandmother, whom she dearly loved, had suffered a heart attack several years prior and spent her final days in a hospital not unlike this one. The helplessness Emily felt at that time had driven her to pursue nursing, giving her the skills she needed to care for people in their most vulnerable moments. Just as Emily was preparing to check in on Mrs. Callahan herself, the silence was shattered by the hurried clatter of footsteps. A team of paramedics rushed into the ER, wheeling in a stretcher carrying an elderly woman with ashen skin and shallow breathing. Emily's instincts kicked in immediately, and she joined the team as they navigated the woman, Dorothy Jenkins, into the treatment area. "What's her condition?" Emily asked one of the paramedics as they moved quickly. "Unconscious and unresponsive. Blood glucose levels are dangerously high, and she's severely dehydrated. We're suspecting diabetic ketoacidosis or possibly a hyperosmolar coma," the paramedic replied, his voice tight with urgency. As they positioned Dorothy in a bed, Emily hooked up the monitors and checked her vitals. Dorothy's breathing was labored. Her skin was dry and papery, and her pulse was weak. The situation was critical, but Emily's training took over as she focused on stabilizing her. In the middle of the commotion, Dr. Ambrose entered, his expression unreadable. He glanced at Dorothy Jenkins, and for a fleeting moment, Emily noticed a strange tension in his gaze. His face was as impassive as ever, but his eyes had a flicker of something: anxiety, regret. It was difficult to tell, but Emily's instincts told her there was more to it. Without preamble, Dr. Ambrose issued his orders. We need an insulin drip started immediately and IV fluids set up. We have to get her rehydrated and stabilize her glucose levels. Emily and the team worked swiftly to carry out his instructions. Moments later, Dorothy's family arrived. Her son, Malcolm, and his wife, Sarah, with their young daughter, Grace, in tow. They watched with worried eyes as Emily tried to reassure them, explaining that the team was doing everything they could. "Will she be okay?" Malcolm asked, his voice breaking with worry. Emily glanced at Dr. Ambrose, who nodded curtly, silently signaling her to answer. "We're doing everything we can, Mr. Jenkins. Dorothy is in critical condition, but we have her stabilized for now. We'll keep you updated with any changes," Emily assured them. After a tense few hours, Dorothy's condition finally stabilized, though she remained unconscious. Emily finished her notes at the nurse's station, preparing to check in on Mrs. Callahan, when Dr. Ambrose's voice startled her. "Nurse Hart," he called, his tone as sharp as ever. "I'm assigning you to be Mrs. Callahan's primary nurse from now on. Keep a close eye on her vitals and report any changes to me directly." Emily blinked, surprised. It was unusual for Dr. Ambrose to make such a request. Why would he want a specific nurse assigned to a comatose patient who hadn't shown any change in months? "Yes, doctor," she replied, trying to mask her curiosity. As Dr. Ambrose walked away, she couldn't help but feel a creeping sense of foreboding. His sudden attention to Mrs. Callahan, his mysterious demeanor, and his unusual interest in the comatose patient, it all hinted at something more than medical concern. Over the next few hours, Emily completed her rounds, but kept a close eye on Dr. Ambrose's movements, noting that he returned to Mrs. Callahan's room multiple times throughout the night. Then, around 3 a.m., while updating Mrs. Callahan's chart, Emily noticed something odd in the records. Mrs. Callahan had been prescribed a new medication that wasn't in her file the last time she checked. The drug, labeled experimental, had no further details, and Emily found herself frowning at the vague entry. As she pondered this, a shadow crossed the room, and she looked up to see Dr. Ambrose standing in the doorway, watching her intently. His expression was calm, but his eyes held a warning. "Nurse Hart, I assume you'll keep Mrs. Callahan's records in order?" he asked, his tone flat, yet edged with something she couldn't quite name. "Yes, Dr. Ambrose," she replied, her heart pounding as she met his gaze. But the quiet intensity of his stare told her one thing. He knew she was curious, and he wasn't going to make finding answers easy. The following night, the hospital was just as quiet, yet the air felt thicker with tension. Nurse Emily Hart arrived for her shift, feeling the familiar pulse of anxiety after the events of the previous night. Her mind was racing with questions, but she had no answers. Dr. Ambrose's behavior and his cryptic instructions for Mrs. Callahan lingered in her thoughts, casting a shadow over her evening. As she passed the nurse's station, she saw Mia again, who greeted her with a sympathetic smile. "Long night ahead, huh?" Maya asked, glancing at the clock as it ticked past 11 p.m. Emily nodded, trying to mask her unease. "Yeah, but there's something off about it." "I don't know, Mia. There's a strange vibe tonight. Dr. Ambrose is acting even more peculiar than usual." Mia raised an eyebrow. "Ambrose, huh? I heard he left the hospital late last night, way past his shift. Wonder what kept him so long." Emily bit her lip, tempted to confide in her friend, but unsure how much to reveal. Instead, she decided to check in on Mrs. Callahan right away. If Dr. Ambrose was as fixated on this patient as he seemed, she wanted to make sure nothing was out of place. When she arrived at room 407, the lights were dimmed, casting soft shadows across the room. Mrs. Callahan lay in her bed, motionless, her face calm but pale under the glow of the monitor's soft light. Emily approached the bed, checking the IV and confirming that her vitals were stable. She studied the chart again, her eyes landing on the experimental medication that had mysteriously appeared. Still no details. She made a mental note to ask the pharmacist about it, wondering if perhaps they could shed some light on this mysterious treatment. But as she reached the door, a sound stopped her in her tracks, a faint, irregular beeping from the machine monitoring Mrs. Callahan's heart rate. Emily turned quickly, watching the monitor as the beats became more erratic, dipping dangerously low before returning to normal. Emily's pulse quickened as she approached the bed again, closely monitoring the readings. Her instincts told her something was wrong, but the moment passed as quickly as it had begun. The monitor's rhythm returned to its steady, even pace, leaving her wondering if it had simply been a glitch. As she stood by Mrs. Callahan's bed, Dr. Ambrose appeared in the doorway, his figure outlined by the fluorescent light of the hallway. He looked at her with a slight frown, as if displeased to find her there. "Nurse Hart," he said, his voice calm but with an undertone of authority, "I thought you would be attending to your other patients." Emily felt a shiver run down her spine, but she forced herself to remain calm. "I was just completing my check on Mrs. Callahan. There was a slight irregularity in her heart rate, but it seems to have stabilized." Dr. Ambrose's gaze was unwavering, and for a moment, it felt as though he were trying to read her thoughts. Then he gave a curt nod. "Good, but I'd appreciate it if you kept your observations brief. Mrs. Callahan's case is sensitive, and we need to ensure minimal disturbances." Emily nodded, but his response only added to her unease. "Of course, Dr. Ambrose. I'll make sure she's comfortable." He lingered in the doorway for a moment longer, his eyes narrowed as though he were assessing her, before he finally turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing down the hallway. As soon as he was out of sight, Emily let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Her gut told her there was more to this sensitive case than Dr. Ambrose was letting on. She resolved to keep a close eye on Mrs. Callahan's condition and Dr. Ambrose's interactions with her. The rest of the night passed without incident, and as the hours wore on, Emily's thoughts kept circling back to the mysterious experimental medication in Mrs. Callahan's chart. By the time her shift ended, she had decided to investigate further. The next afternoon, she stopped by the hospital pharmacy, hoping to gather more information. The pharmacist, a friendly woman named Rachel, greeted her warmly. "Hey, Emily, how can I help you today?" Rachel asked, pushing her glasses up her nose. "Hey, Rachel, I had a question about a medication that was prescribed to one of my patients in the ICU. It's labeled as experimental, but there's no other information on it. I was hoping you might have some details," Emily said, keeping her tone casual. Rachel frowned, checking her records. "We don't typically handle experimental drugs without a trial number and associated documentation. Which patient are you asking about?" "Mrs. Callahan in room 407, Emily replied, glancing around to ensure they weren't being overheard. Rachel typed into her computer, her brow furrowing as she scanned the screen. "I'm not seeing anything under that patient's record for experimental medication. Are you sure it was listed in her chart?" Emily's stomach tightened. "Yes, I'm certain. It was in her file last night." Rachel shook her head, looking concerned. "If it's not here, that's a serious oversight. Only authorized personnel are supposed to handle medications like that. I'll look into it on my end, but be careful. If someone's administering unregistered drugs, that's a major violation." Emily's heart raced as she thanked Rachel, feeling a wave of dread settle over her. Dr. Ambrose had specifically mentioned that she was to keep a close eye on Mrs. Callahan, But had he been overseeing the administration of an unauthorized medication? And if so, why? That night, Emily arrived early for her shift, her mind racing with possibilities. She couldn't help but feel a pang of fear mixed with determination. If Dr. Ambrose was indeed hiding something, she needed to uncover the truth, not just for Mrs. Callahan's sake, but for every patient in the hospital. Around midnight, as she checked on her patients, Emily noticed Dr. Ambrose slip into Mrs. Callahan's room once again. This time, she quietly followed, standing just outside the door and listening intently. She could hear his low, murmured voice, though the words were indistinguishable. But then, something caught her attention. A faint sound, like the hiss of a vial being opened. Emily peered through the small glass window on the door, watching as Dr. Ambrose leaned over Mrs. Callahan, holding a syringe filled with a clear liquid. Her heart skipped a beat as she realized what he was about to do. She wanted to burst into the room, to demand an explanation, but she forced herself to stay hidden, watching and waiting. After injecting the liquid into Mrs. Callahan's IV, Dr. Ambrose glanced at his watch, his face calm and unreadable. He stayed by her bedside for a few minutes, his gaze focused intently on the monitors as if waiting for a reaction. Emily watched in horror as Mrs. Callahan's heart rate dipped, then steadied again. It was the same pattern she had observed earlier, a sudden drop, followed by stabilization. Just as she was beginning to wonder if she should confront him, Dr. Ambrose turned and left the room, walking briskly down the hallway. Emily waited until his footsteps faded, then slipped into Mrs. Callahan's room, her heart pounding as she approached the bed. She checked the IV line, confirming that a new substance had indeed been added. Her hands trembled as she adjusted the monitors, trying to make sense of what she had witnessed. She knew she couldn't confront Dr. Ambrose without proof, but she was determined to find out what he was injecting into Mrs. Callahan. It was as if he were testing something, waiting for a specific reaction, a response that, for some reason, was deeply important to him. Emily spent the rest of her shift in a state of heightened vigilance, checking on Mrs. Callahan frequently, monitoring her vitals, and watching for any sign of a reaction to the unknown substance. But as dawn approached, Mrs. Callahan's condition remained stable, leaving Emily with more questions than answers. As her shift ended, she resolved to speak with Mia, and perhaps even one of the senior nurses about her suspicions. She knew it was a risk, but her conscience wouldn't allow her to ignore what she had seen. The lines between right and wrong were becoming increasingly blurred, and Emily could feel herself being pulled into a web of secrecy and deception that seemed to go far deeper than she'd initially realized. But one thing was certain, she couldn't face this alone. The morning light filtered through the hospital's windows as Nurse Emily Hart ended her shift, but her mind was far from at ease. The events of the past 2 nights had left her shaken and filled with questions she couldn't ignore. She felt certain that something dark was unfolding within the walls of Horizon Haven, and Dr. Ambrose was at the center of it. After a few hours of restless sleep, Emily awoke with a plan. She would need allies. She couldn't tackle this alone, and the risk of going against Dr. Ambrose without support was too high. She decided to approach one of the hospital's senior nurses, Patricia Hayes, someone she trusted and respected. Patricia had been at Horizon Haven for nearly 20 years. If anyone knew the inner workings of the hospital, it was her. Emily found Patricia in the hospital cafeteria that afternoon, her usual stack of patient files beside her as she sipped her coffee. Emily approached cautiously, taking a deep breath before speaking. "Patricia, can I talk to you about something unusual?" Emily asked, keeping her voice low. Patricia looked up, her eyes warm but perceptive. "Of course, dear. You look troubled. Sit down." Emily glanced around to make sure no one was listening, then took a seat across from Patricia. She explained the events of the past 2 nights, the experimental medication, Dr. Ambrose's secretive behavior, and the unexplained injection he had given to Mrs. Callahan. Patricia listened intently, her expression growing more serious with each detail. When Emily finished, Patricia's brow was furrowed, and she seemed deep in thought. "I've known Dr. Ambrose for years," Patricia began, her voice measured. "He's always been intense, maybe a bit too detached. But what you're describing goes beyond anything I would have expected from him. Experimental drugs, unlogged injections. Emily, if what you're saying is true, this is a serious violation of medical ethics." "I know," Emily replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just don't know what to do. I can't confront him without evidence, and if he's as influential as people say, he might be able to cover it up." Patricia nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. "I agree. You need more than just suspicions if you're going to challenge someone like Dr. Ambrose. But if he's violating protocol, there must be some record of it somewhere, perhaps hidden in the pharmacy or in his private office." Emily's heart pounded at the thought. It was a risky proposition, but Patricia was right. If she could find documentation linking Dr. Ambrose to the experimental treatment, she might be able to expose the truth. "I'll try to gather more information," Emily said, feeling the newfound resolve. "But I might need your help." Patricia gave her a reassuring smile. "I'll do what I can. And Emily, if you ever feel you're in danger, come straight to me. We'll figure this out together." Later that night, Emily returned to the hospital with a renewed sense of purpose. She began her shift with her usual duties, but her mind was focused on one goal: finding evidence that could expose Dr. Ambrose's actions. She knew it wouldn't be easy. The hospital was under tight security, and Dr. Ambrose was meticulous. But she was determined. Around midnight, as the hospital quieted down, Emily decided to make her move. She slipped away from the nurse's station, her footsteps silent as she made her way down the corridor toward the small office Dr. Ambrose used for private consultations. It was locked, as she'd expected, but she knew Patricia had a spare set of keys for emergencies. With her heart pounding, she used Patricia's key to unlock the door and stepped inside, flicking on the small desk lamp. The office was as clinical and orderly as Dr. Ambrose himself, with shelves lined with medical textbooks and neatly organized files. Emily scanned the room, searching for anything that might connect him to the experimental drug. She rifled through the drawers, careful not to disturb the order, until she found a file labeled Research Protocols. Her pulse quickened as she opened it, flipping through pages of clinical trials and case studies. Toward the back of the file, she found what she'd been hoping for: a document marked Confidential, Experimental Treatment for Comatose Patients. The document detailed a trial involving a drug designed to stimulate brain activity in patients in prolonged comatose states. The trial had been proposed as a last resort treatment, but there was a clear warning that the drug was still in the experimental phase and had not been approved by regulatory authorities. The risks were extensive, including potential brain damage, cardiac irregularities, and even death. Emily's hands shook as she read through the list of names on the document's approval sheet, and there it was, Dr. Charles Ambrose's signature at the bottom, approving the trial for patients under his care. But there was something else that caught her eye: a clause that stated the trial had been terminated after initial tests showed severe adverse reactions. The experiment had been deemed too dangerous, and all patients involved were to be monitored for recovery without further intervention. So why, Emily wondered, was Dr. Ambrose still administering the drug? She quickly copied the document's contents onto her phone, taking photos of each page. As she finished, she heard footsteps in the hallway. Her stomach clenched, and she quickly returned the file to its original place, turning off the lamp and slipping out of the room just as Dr. Ambrose turned the corner. Their eyes met, and for a moment, Emily thought she'd been caught. But Dr. Ambrose only nodded, his expression unreadable. "Nurse Hart," he said, his tone as cold and clipped as ever. "Shouldn't you be attending to your patients?" "Of course, doctor," Emily replied, forcing herself to stay calm. "Just making sure everything's in order for the night." Dr. Ambrose's gaze lingered on her for a moment longer, as if he were trying to decipher her thoughts. Then, without another word, he continued down the hallway, his footsteps fading into the distance. Emily let out a shaky breath, her heart racing as she returned to her duties. She had the evidence she needed, but it wouldn't be enough on its own. She needed a witness, someone who could confirm her suspicions and testify to Dr. Ambrose's actions. Over the next few nights, Emily kept a close watch on Mrs. Callahan, documenting every irregularity in her heart rate, every injection Dr. Ambrose administered, and every subtle change in her condition. She shared her findings with Patricia, who agreed that the situation was serious enough to warrant further investigation. But as they delved deeper, Emily began to notice subtle shifts in Dr. Ambrose's behavior. He seemed to be watching her more closely, his gaze colder, more intense. She could feel the tension building, like a storm waiting to break. One night, as Emily was making her rounds, she noticed Dr. Ambrose entering Mrs. Callahan's room once again. This time, she couldn't hold back. She followed him, her footsteps silent, and positioned herself just outside the door. She watched through the small window as Dr. Ambrose leaned over Mrs. Callahan, his face impassive as he prepared another injection. But this time, there was something different in his expression, a hint of desperation, perhaps, or fear. As he injected the drug into Mrs. Callahan's IV, Emily felt a surge of anger and fear. She couldn't let this continue. She had to do something. Summoning her courage, she knocked on the door, her heart pounding as she stepped inside. "Dr. Ambrose," she said, her voice steady despite her racing pulse. "What are you doing?" Dr. Ambrose straightened, his expression cold and unyielding. "Nurse Hart, this is none of your concern. I suggest you focus on your duties and leave this matter to me." Emily took a step closer, refusing to back down. "I've seen the records, doctor. I know about the experimental treatment and the risks associated with it. This patient deserves better than to be used as a test subject." Dr. Ambrose's face darkened, a dangerous glint in his eyes. "You don't understand, Nurse Hart. This drug could be the key to awakening patients who've been trapped in comas for years. Mrs. Callahan's family agreed to the treatment. They want her to have every chance at recovery." "But the trial was terminated," Emily insisted. "The risks are too high, and the drug isn't approved. You're putting her life in danger." Dr. Ambrose took a step forward, his voice low and filled with a chilling intensity. "I'm not just doing this for Mrs. Callahan. This treatment could change everything, save countless lives. If there's even a chance it could work, I'm willing to take that risk." Emily felt a wave of disgust as she realized the extent of his obsession. He wasn't acting out of compassion or duty. He was driven by ambition, by a desire to make a name for himself, no matter the cost. "This isn't medicine," she said, her voice trembling with anger. "It's exploitation." Dr. Ambrose's expression shifted, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. For a moment, Emily thought she might have reached him, that he might see reason. But then his eyes hardened, and he turned away. "Consider this your final warning, Nurse Hart," he said coldly. "Interfere again, and there will be consequences." With that, he left the room, leaving Emily alone with Mrs. Callahan, her heart pounding with fear and fury. As she looked down at the unconscious woman, Emily knew she couldn't let this continue. Dr. Ambrose's ambitions were endangering lives, and if he wouldn't stop, she would have to find a way to stop him herself. She took a deep breath, her resolve hardening. This fight was far from over, and she would do whatever it took to protect her patients, even if it meant putting her own career on the line. The hospital hallways felt colder than usual that night, as though a chill had seeped into the walls. Nurse Emily Hart had returned to her shift with a newfound resolve, yet an unmistakable weight pressed down on her. Dr. Ambrose's warning replayed in her mind like a haunting echo, but she knew she couldn't turn back now. Too many lives were at risk, and Mrs. Callahan's health seemed to be hanging by a fragile thread. She couldn't help but think about what would happen if Dr. Ambrose continued his reckless experiments. The experimental drug he was using might eventually cause irreparable damage to Mrs. Callahan, or worse. Emily felt a surge of anger at the thought. As a nurse, she dedicated her life to healing and compassion. Yet Dr. Ambrose's actions mocked everything she stood for. She knew she couldn't expose him on her own. After all, she was just one nurse, and Dr. Ambrose held power and influence at Horizon Haven. She needed allies, people she could trust to help her gather evidence, to corroborate her findings, and to stand with her against the man who held everyone's respect in a clenched fist. The first person who came to mind was Dr. Liam Morales, a neurologist who had recently joined the hospital. Emily had worked with him on a few cases and had been impressed by his integrity and dedication. He was known for being vocal about patient rights and had already challenged hospital policies he deemed unethical. If anyone would be willing to help her, it was Dr. Morales. As her shift began, Emily sought him out, finally catching him in his office as he reviewed patient files. Dr. Morales looked up, smiling warmly when he saw her, his face creasing with curiosity. "Emily, come in. What brings you here?" he asked, gesturing to a chair across from him. Emily took a deep breath and sat down, her hands nervously clasped in her lap. "Dr. Morales, I need to talk to you about something sensitive. Something I believe is happening under the radar, and it's putting a patient in serious danger." His brows furrowed as he leaned forward, his gaze sharpening. "Go on." Emily recounted everything she'd observed. Dr. Ambrose's late-night visits, the unauthorized medication, the irregularities in Mrs. Callahan's vitals, and her conversation with Patricia, the senior nurse. Dr. Morales listened carefully, his expression growing more grim with every detail. When she finished, he was silent for a moment, his fingers steepled as he weighed her words. "You're saying Dr. Ambrose is administering an experimental drug without authorization, and that this drug is unapproved and potentially dangerous." Emily nodded, feeling a flicker of relief that he hadn't immediately dismissed her. "Yes. I have reason to believe he's using Mrs. Callahan as a test subject without her family's full consent. He mentioned the family agreed to give her every chance at recovery, but I'm not convinced they know the risks." Dr. Morales sighed, rubbing his temples. "This is troubling, to say the least. And if what you're saying is true, Dr. Ambrose could face severe consequences, legally and professionally. But we need proof, Emily. Solid proof that he's administering the drug illegally. I've taken photos of the documents I found in his office," Emily said, her voice a mix of hope and tension. "But I agree, it might not be enough. I was hoping maybe you could help me track down any records that might indicate where he's sourcing the drug. Or, if possible, speak with Mrs. Callahan's family. They deserve to know the truth." Dr. Morales nodded thoughtfully. "I can try. But you should know, this could put both of us at risk. Dr. Ambrose is well connected, and he won't take accusations like these lightly. If he finds out we're investigating him." Emily's heart pounded, but she nodded firmly. "I understand. But I can't stand by and watch him harm an innocent patient. I have to do something, even if it means taking a risk." Dr. Morales studied her for a long moment, then offered a reassuring smile. "All right. I'm with you. We'll approach this carefully, gather what we need, and ensure there's no room for doubt. Let's start with Mrs. Callahan's family. If we can get them on our side, they may be able to give us permission to access her full medical records." Relief flooded through Emily, and for the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope. Together, they could expose the truth. The next day, Dr. Morales arranged a meeting with Mrs. Callahan's son, James, a soft-spoken man in his early 30s who had been by his mother's side almost every day since her hospitalization. Emily was there as well, ready to support Dr. Morales as he delicately explained their concerns. James listened, his face paling as Dr. Morales revealed the possibility that his mother was being given an unapproved drug without full disclosure of the risks. His hand shook slightly as he absorbed the news. I knew they were trying some kind of treatment, but I never realized it was experimental," he stammered, his voice thick with worry. "I just wanted to give her a chance, you know. They told me this could help bring her back." Emily felt a surge of sympathy for him. "James, I understand. We're not trying to alarm you. But your mother's health could be at serious risk if Dr. Ambrose continues using this drug. You have the right to know exactly what's being done to help or harm her." James nodded, his expression hardening. "If he's doing something without our permission, I want it stopped. I want to see her records, everything that's been done to her." Dr. Morales nodded, his voice calm and steady. "We'll help you access the records, and I'll make sure you're fully informed of any treatments moving forward. You have my word, James." With James's support, Emily and Dr. Morales were able to review Mrs. Callahan's full medical history. As they suspected, there was no official documentation of the experimental drug in her chart. It was as though Dr. Ambrose had erased every trace, covering his tracks with a meticulous precision that only fueled their suspicions. But as they reviewed the records, Emily noticed something else that disturbed her: a pattern of fluctuations in Mrs. Callahan's vitals, corresponding almost perfectly with Dr. Ambrose's late-night visits. Each time he administered the drug, her heart rate dipped, her blood pressure spiked, and her oxygen levels fluctuated. It was clear that her body was reacting to the treatment in unpredictable and dangerous ways. Emily felt a chill as she realized the extent of the risk. If they didn't act soon, Mrs. Callahan might suffer permanent damage, or worse. That night, Emily prepared herself for a confrontation. She knew Dr. Ambrose would make his usual rounds around midnight, and this time, she would be waiting. She enlisted Patricia's help, asking her to keep watch outside the room in case things escalated. She didn't know what Dr. Ambrose was capable of, but she wasn't willing to take any chances. Just as expected, Dr. Ambrose appeared shortly after midnight, his expression unreadable as he entered Mrs. Callahan's room. Emily waited in the shadows, her heart pounding as she watched him prepare another syringe. She knew she had to act before he injected the drug. Stepping forward, she cleared her throat, her voice steady but filled with conviction. "Dr. Ambrose, stop. I know what you're doing." Dr. Ambrose froze, his face twisting with anger as he turned to face her. "Nurse Hart," he said, his voice dangerously low. "I warned you to stay out of this." Emily didn't flinch. "And I warned you that Mrs. Callahan deserves better than to be used as a test subject. We have her son's permission to access her records, and we know about the drug. This ends now." Dr. Ambrose's expression hardened, a hint of panic flickering in his eyes. But he quickly masked it, his tone turning cold and condescending. "You're in over your head, Nurse Hart. You don't understand the importance of this research. This drug has the potential to revolutionize medicine. If we can bring patients like Mrs. Callahan back, we could change everything." Emily shook her head, her voice firm. "No medical breakthrough is worth risking a life without consent. You're putting your ambition above your patient's welfare. And that's not just unethical, it's criminal." Dr. Ambrose took a step closer, his gaze intense and unyielding. "I am saving lives. Sometimes that requires risk, something you clearly don't understand." Emily's heart raced, but she stood her ground. "I understand more than you think, Dr. Ambrose. And I understand that what you're doing is wrong. We have enough evidence to bring this to the hospital board, and if you don't stop now, you'll be facing consequences far beyond Horizon Haven." For a moment, it seemed like he might relent, but then his expression shifted, a cold smile spreading across his face. "You really think they'll listen to a nurse over a doctor with my credentials?" He sneered. "Go ahead, report me. But know this, you'll be putting your own career at risk. And I guarantee, once this is over, you'll regret ever crossing me." With that, he pushed past her, his footsteps echoing down the hallway. Emily stood there, her body trembling with a mixture of fear and triumph. She knew he wasn't bluffing. Dr. Ambrose had the influence to ruin her if he chose to. But she also knew that she couldn't back down now. As she looked at Mrs. Callahan, lying unconscious but stable, Emily felt a surge of determination. She'd come too far to turn back now. No matter the cost, she would see this through to the end. She returned to Patricia and Dr. Morales, her resolve firm. "He knows we're onto him," she said, her voice steady. "But he's not going to stop. We have to take this to the hospital board. And we have to make sure they listen." Dr. Morales placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We will. You're not alone, Emily. We'll do this together." And as they prepared their case, Emily felt a glimmer of hope. She knew the road ahead would be treacherous, but for the first time, she felt certain that justice was within reach. The next morning, Emily awoke with a sharp sense of purpose and unease. The confrontation with Dr. Ambrose lingered in her thoughts, his cold smile and chilling words echoing in her mind. She knew he was a man capable of manipulation and intimidation, and his warning had been clear. This wouldn't be an easy fight. Emily arrived at Horizon Haven that day with a renewed determination. She met with Dr. Morales and Patricia in a small, secluded meeting room they'd managed to secure. The three of them knew that from here on, every step they took had to be precise and calculated. "Dr. Ambrose is going to come after us with everything he has," Patricia said, her voice tinged with worry as she flipped through a folder of evidence they'd gathered. "He has the administration's ear. He's protected." Dr. Morales nodded solemnly. "That's true. But if we approach this the right way, we might have a chance. Emily, do we have a clear record of the irregularities in Mrs. Callahan's health? I think we should document every pattern we can find and bring it to the ethics board." Emily pulled out a notebook and several printouts, laying them across the table. "I've logged every spike and dip in her vitals over the past month, and it matches Dr. Ambrose's visits almost perfectly. Plus, we have the photo evidence from his files on the experimental drug trial." Patricia scanned the pages with a keen eye. "This is strong evidence, but it may not be enough on its own. If Dr. Ambrose catches wind of what we're doing, he could manipulate the records. He's cunning enough to cover his tracks, and the board has always shown him favoritism." Emily felt a pang of frustration. "There has to be something more we can do. Is there anyone we can trust in administration? Maybe someone with the integrity to act on this, or at least ensure it's properly investigated." Dr. Morales leaned back, rubbing his temples thoughtfully. "If we go through internal channels, Dr. Ambrose may be alerted before we even have a chance to make our case. He has friends in high places. But there is someone we could reach out to, a contact of mine at the State Medical Licensing Board. Her name's Sandra Reese. She's conducted investigations into unethical practices before, and she's independent of the hospital. If we present our findings to her, she might be able to take this directly to the state." Emily's eyes widened with hope. "That sounds like exactly what we need. If she can bring in an external investigation, Dr. Ambrose won't be able to manipulate the outcome." Dr. Morales glanced at his watch. "I can make the call this afternoon, but we'll need to tread carefully. If Dr. Ambrose catches wind of this, he may try to destroy our evidence, or worse, escalate his experiments with Mrs. Callahan to cover his tracks." Patricia nodded, her face grim. "We should also keep a closer watch on Mrs. Callahan's health. If her condition worsens, Dr. Ambrose might claim she was deteriorating naturally, or that his treatments were necessary. We can't let him twist the truth." Later that afternoon, Dr. Morales made the call to Sandra Reese, briefing her on their findings and the urgent need for an external investigation. Sandra listened carefully, her voice steady and reassuring, even as she asked him to send over the evidence they'd gathered. "Sandra is on board," Dr. Morales told Emily and Patricia after ending the call. "She says she'll review our documentation tonight and reach out to us with the next steps by tomorrow. She's aware of the risks and said she'll keep this confidential." Emily felt a wave of relief, but also a new sense of responsibility. They were officially taking this battle beyond the walls of Horizon Haven, and there was no turning back. That night, as Emily returned to her rounds, she found herself drawn to Mrs. Callahan's room. Despite the late hour, she felt an overwhelming need to check on the woman who'd become the focus of her struggle. As she entered the dimly lit room, Emily gazed down at Mrs. Callahan, whose face was serene, oblivious to the turmoil unfolding around her. But as she adjusted the monitors and IV lines, something on the table by the bedside caught her eye. A small glass vial, half empty and labeled with a scrawled code she didn't recognize. Emily's pulse quickened. This was it. This had to be the experimental drug Dr. Ambrose was using. Careful not to disturb anything, she slipped her phone from her pocket and took a few pictures of the vial, making sure to capture the label and serial number. Then she carefully wrapped the vial in a glove and placed it in her pocket. She knew this was a risk, but she needed more than just records and logs. This vial could be the physical evidence Sandra needed to make her case. As she left the room, she nearly collided with Dr. Ambrose in the hallway. His eyes narrowed as he took in her startled expression, his gaze flickering with suspicion. "Nurse Hart," he said slowly, his voice a low murmur, "what are you doing in Mrs. Callahan's room at this hour?" Emily steadied herself, meeting his cold stare. "Just routine checks, doctor. I wanted to make sure her IVs were secure." He held her gaze, his face unreadable, before finally nodding. "See that you're thorough. Mrs. Callahan's care is delicate." There was an edge to his tone that sent a chill down her spine, but she forced herself to remain composed. "Of course, doctor. I understand." Dr. Ambrose lingered for a moment longer, his gaze sharp and calculating, before he turned and strode down the hallway. Emily watched him go, her heart racing as she quickly made her way to the nurse's station. She knew she had to get the vial to Sandra without delay. The next morning, she met with Dr. Morales and Patricia in a secluded corner of the hospital parking lot, her hand trembling slightly as she showed them the vial. "This is it," she said, her voice hushed but filled with urgency. "The drug he's been injecting into Mrs. Callahan. If we can analyze it, we'll have undeniable proof of his misconduct." Dr. Morales took the vial, studying it with a grim expression. "I'll send this to Sandra right away. She has contacts in forensic pharmacology who can run tests. With any luck, we'll know exactly what's in this by the end of the week." Patricia nodded, her face lined with worry. "We need to be prepared for Dr. Ambrose's reaction. He's already suspicious of us, and if he realizes the vial is missing, he may retaliate." Emily clenched her fists, her determination hardening. "Let him try. We're close now, and I won't let him intimidate us. Mrs. Callahan deserves justice, and so do the other patients he might harm if this goes unchecked." They agreed to continue their watch on Mrs. Callahan and waited anxiously for Sandra's response. Over the next 2 days, Emily noticed Dr. Ambrose growing increasingly agitated. His visits to Mrs. Callahan became more frequent, his demeanor more tense. She could sense that he was aware something was wrong, and she suspected he was beginning to unravel under the pressure. Finally, Sandra called Dr. Morales with the results. He immediately gathered Emily and Patricia in a quiet room to share the news. The drug is a highly concentrated stimulant designed to force neural activity in patients with comatose brain states, Dr. Morales explained, his voice filled with a mixture of relief and anger. "The problem is, it's highly unstable, and in doses as high as Dr. Ambrose was administering, it can cause fatal arrhythmias, brain hemorrhaging, and severe organ damage. This isn't medicine, it's poison." Emily felt a surge of outrage. He knew this, didn't he? He must have known the risks and still went ahead with it. He was willing to sacrifice Mrs. Callahan's life for the sake of his experiment. Dr. Morales nodded, his face grim. "Sandra says we have enough to bring this to the state medical board, and they're willing to launch an investigation. But we need to confront Dr. Ambrose one last time. Sandra believes that with the pressure of an impending investigation, he might admit to his actions." Emily's stomach churned at the thought of facing Dr. Ambrose again, but she knew it was necessary. If they could get him to confess, they could ensure he'd never harm another patient. The next day, they arranged a meeting with Dr. Ambrose under the pretense of discussing Mrs. Callahan's treatment. Patricia, Emily, and Dr. Morales waited in a small conference room, the tension palpable as they prepared themselves for the confrontation. When Dr. Ambrose entered, his face was tight, his eyes sharp and wary. He took one look at the three of them and seemed to sense that this was more than a routine meeting. "What is this about?" he asked coldly, his gaze shifting between them. Dr. Morells met his stare with unflinching resolve. "Dr. Ambrose, we know about the experimental drug. We know you've been administering it to Mrs. Callahan without her family's informed consent. We also know the risks and the damage it could have caused her." Dr. Ambrose's face paled, but he quickly masked it with a sneer. "You're making baseless accusations. This is slander, and I won't stand for it." Emily held up the evidence folder, her hand steady. "This isn't slander, Dr. Ambrose. We have documentation of the drug, the risks, and photos of the vial. The State Medical Board is preparing to investigate, and if you don't cooperate, you'll be facing legal action." For a moment, Dr. Ambrose looked genuinely rattled, his composure faltering. But then his expression hardened, and he straightened, his eyes filled with fury. "You think you can ruin me?" He spat, his voice filled with venom. "I saved more lives than you could possibly comprehend. Mrs. Callahan was a small price to pay for the advancements we could have made. Sometimes you have to sacrifice a few to save the many." Emily's heart ached with anger and disgust. Mrs. Callahan is not a price to pay. She's a human being, and she deserves better than to be a pawn in your twisted experiment. Dr. Ambrose glared at them, his face flushed with rage. But he seemed to realize he was cornered, and his shoulders sagged as the weight of his actions settled on him. With one last, seething look, he stormed out of the room, leaving them in stunned silence. Dr. Morells let out a shaky breath, a sense of relief filling the room. "We did it," he said, his voice filled with quiet triumph. "He's finished." Emily and Patricia exchanged a look, knowing the battle was over, and justice was within reach. The investigation would take time, but they had succeeded in stopping Dr. Ambrose's reign of unethical experimentation. As Emily left the hospital that day, she felt a profound sense of fulfillment. She had fought for what was right, protecting a patient's dignity and humanity in the face of overwhelming odds. And though the journey had been harrowing, she knew that it had been worth every moment. Justice would prevail. The days that followed the confrontation with Dr. Ambrose were a whirlwind of emotions, formalities, and upheaval. Word of the scandal quickly spread throughout Horizon Haven, sending shockwaves through the entire hospital. The once highly respected Dr. Charles Ambrose was now the subject of an official state investigation, and the staff buzzed with a mixture of disbelief, fear, and anger. Emily Hart felt like she was walking through a dream, the events of the past few weeks replaying in her mind as she went about her shifts. Despite everything, she continued to care for her patients with the same dedication and compassion as before. She knew that what she'd done was right, but the intensity of the experience had left her feeling raw and vulnerable. Dr. Morells and Patricia stood by her side, their solidarity unwavering. As the investigation gained momentum, Sandra Reese from the State Medical Board arrived at the hospital to lead the inquiry. She brought a team of legal and medical experts with her, and over the course of several days, they meticulously reviewed Dr. Ambrose's files, conducted interviews, and analyzed every aspect of his experimental treatment. One afternoon, Sandra asked Emily, Dr. Morells, and Patricia to join her in a private meeting room. She wore a look of grim satisfaction as she gestured for them to sit down, her gaze steady and serious. "I wanted to thank each of you for your courage in coming forward," Sandra began, her tone warm but professional. "I've seen many cases of unethical practices, but few have been as troubling as this one. Dr. Ambrose's actions went far beyond simple misconduct. He showed a blatant disregard for patient safety and crossed numerous ethical boundaries." Emily nodded, feeling a sense of validation wash over her. "So, what happens next?" Sandra leaned forward, her expression hardening. "Dr. Ambrose's medical license has been suspended pending a full review, and we're recommending permanent revocation. Given the evidence you provided, there's a strong case for criminal charges as well." He knowingly administered an unapproved drug to a vulnerable patient without her family's informed consent. That's not just unethical, it's illegal. Dr. Morels let out a long breath, relief evident in his posture. Thank you, Sandra. We were worried he might try to manipulate the investigation or find a way to cover his tracks. Sandra smiled, a glint of determination in her eyes. He tried, believe me. But with the records you kept and the vial Emily secured, his actions are well documented. The state won't be able to ignore this, and Dr. Ambrose will face the consequences of his decisions. Patricia reached over and squeezed Emily's hand. You did it, Emily. You fought for Mrs. Callahan when no one else would. That takes more than just courage. It takes heart. Emily blinked back tears, feeling the weight of her journey settle over her. She thought of Mrs. Callahan lying in her hospital bed, still in a coma, still vulnerable, but now safe from harm. Knowing she had been able to protect one patient, at least, was a comfort that soothed the ache in her chest. Sandra's voice broke into her thoughts. I want you all to know that this case will serve as an example. We're implementing stricter regulations on experimental treatments across the state, ensuring patients and their families are fully informed and protected from unethical practices. Dr. Ambrose's case will be one of many changes, all thanks to your efforts. Over the next few days, Sandra's team continued their investigation, and Dr. Ambrose's world began to crumble. His colleagues, once his admirers, now avoided him, unable to reconcile the esteemed doctor they'd known with the man who had recklessly endangered a patient's life. The whispers in the hospital grew louder, and the news spread to the medical community at large, casting a shadow over Dr. Ambrose's once brilliant career. Emily's sense of relief was tempered by exhaustion. She found herself retreating to quiet corners of the hospital during breaks, allowing herself moments to process everything that had happened. The weight of what she'd done, the risks she'd taken, the boundaries she'd crossed, settled on her shoulders like a heavy blanket. Yet, through the fatigue and emotional strain, a quiet pride remained. One evening, she visited Mrs. Callahan's room, sitting by her bedside as she had many times before. The woman's face was peaceful, her breathing steady, and Emily reached out, gently taking her hand. Mrs. Callahan, she whispered softly, I promised I'd look after you, and I kept that promise. You might not know it, but you helped me find strength I didn't know I had. And because of you, so many other patients will be protected too. As she sat there, the door opened, and she turned to see Mrs. Callahan's son, James, entering the room. He gave her a warm smile, his eyes filled with gratitude. Nursed heart, he said quietly, taking the seat beside her. I don't know how to thank you for what you've done for my mother. I can't imagine what she would have gone through if you hadn't intervened. Emily felt a lump rise in her throat. I was just doing my duty, Mr. Callahan. Your mother deserves to be treated with respect and dignity, and I couldn't stand by and let anyone take that from her. James looked down, his hands clasped tightly together. Dr. Ambrose. He told us he was doing everything he could to help her. We trusted him. And now, I feel like I failed her. I should have known. Emily reached over, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. You didn't fail her. Dr. Ambrose used his position to manipulate people's trust. He convinced you and others that his way was the only way. That's not your fault. And you did the right thing by supporting us when we needed it. Your support gave us the strength to keep fighting. He nodded, visibly moved, and they sat together in silence, united by their shared commitment to Mrs. Callahan's well-being. Emily found comfort in the knowledge that Mrs. Callahan would now receive genuine, compassionate care without the shadow of exploitation looming over her. The following week, Sandra's report was released, and it was scathing. Dr. Ambrose's license was officially revoked, and he faced criminal charges for his actions, with a pending trial that would determine his fate. The medical community reacted with shock and outrage, and Horizon Haven announced a series of new protocols to prevent similar incidents in the future. For the hospital staff, The aftermath was a time of reflection and change. Emily noticed a shift in her colleagues' attitudes. Nurses, doctors, and administrators alike seemed more conscientious, more aware of their responsibilities to their patients. The sense of trust, once tainted by Dr. Ambrose's actions, slowly began to rebuild, one step at a time. In the months that followed, Emily's life returned to a semblance of normalcy, but she knew she'd been forever changed by the experience. She had discovered a part of herself she hadn't known existed, a strength and resilience that would guide her through whatever challenges lay ahead. And though the fight had been difficult, she knew it had been worth it. One sunny afternoon, as Emily was finishing her shift, Patricia and Dr. Morales approached her with smiles on their faces. "You've become something of a hero around here, Emily," Patricia said, her eyes twinkling. "You know, the nursing staff has been talking about setting up an annual award for courage and dedication, and we'd like you to be its first recipient." Emily's cheeks flushed with surprise and embarrassment. "Oh no, I don't need an award. I was just doing my job." Dr. Morales chuckled. "It's not just about the job, Emily. You reminded us all why we do this work. You reminded us that medicine isn't just about treating patients, it's about caring for them. And that's something worth honoring." Overwhelmed, Emily nodded, a warm feeling spreading through her chest. The hospital might always carry a scar from the ordeal with Dr. Ambrose, but it would also carry her story, a story of resilience, of standing up against injustice, and of the unwavering commitment to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. As she left the hospital that evening, Emily took a deep breath, savoring the cool breeze and the sense of closure. She had confronted fear, risked her career, and faced down one of the hospital's most powerful figures, all in the name of justice. And though the journey had left her scared, it had also left her stronger. Her gaze drifted to the horizon, the future stretching before her, unknown but filled with possibility. She knew that, no matter what challenges awaited her, she would face them with the same courage and integrity that had carried her through this ordeal. And she would always remember Mrs. Callahan, the patient who had taught her the true meaning of compassion and the power of a promise kept. For Emily, this was more than just a victory. It was a transformation. She had found her voice, her strength, and her purpose. And as she walked away from the hospital that day, she knew she would carry those gifts with her for the rest of her life.